There is a particular quality to silence in a room that has just made a catastrophic mistake. I have sat in enough chambers to know it on contact, a held breath, a stillness that is not peace but the pause before a very large thing falls. The sessional hall of the Vethrani Trade Syndicate produced that silence at the 47th minute of the morning session on the 14th day of the third convening period. I remember the minute because I had been counting them for 11 years, and I wanted to be precise when I finally wrote it down. I want to be precise about other things too, about who I am and why I was sitting in that chair and what the folder on the table in front of me contained. Those things are not complicated, but they matter. The syndicate spent 11 years insisting that they did not, and I think that judgment deserves to be examined in the full light of what happened after. My name is Davin Voss. I am 63 years old. I spent 26 years in Earth's commercial trade service, the last 9 of them as a senior envoy in the Outer Lanes Division. I retired from that post 4 years ago at the standard age, with a modest citation and a pension that covers my needs without embarrassment. I am not a remarkable man. I have no gift for oratory, no taste for ceremony, and no patience for the kind of institutional theater that passes for deliberation in most galactic bodies. I mention these qualities because the syndicate, in its final assessment of my presence in the hall that morning, characterized me in a background communication, which was subsequently leaked to 3 commercial news services, and which I read over coffee on a Thursday morning 2 weeks after the session, as a provocateur operating outside the bounds of ordinary diplomatic engagement. I want the record to show what I actually am: a retired civil servant, a widower, and the father of Lena Voss, who died in a Vethrani holding facility on the 11th day of the 4th month, 11 years before I sat down in that chair. That is what I am. That is why I was there. The Vethrani Trade Syndicate is, in formal terms, a certification authority. 6 founding dynasties, the Vethran, the Salakai, the Orath, the Movan, the Drell, and the Prithkan, established it 214 years ago as a body to regulate commercial access across the 41 trade lanes that pass through the systems they collectively control. Certification is the mechanism. To carry goods through a syndicate-affiliated lane, a party must hold a valid Vethrani commercial certificate. Without one, no port will receive your ships, no lane authority will file your transit, no insurance body in the network will cover your cargo. The certificate is not a document. It is a key, and without it, the doors do not open. The syndicate had, over 2 centuries, refined the certification apparatus into something considerably more sophisticated than its founders had originally designed. What began as a practical mechanism for ensuring basic commercial standards had become, by the time Earth first encountered it, an instrument of considerable political utility. Certification could be conditioned, reviewed, suspended, or revoked, and each of those actions carried specific procedural requirements that were, in the syndicate's own application of them, both formally impeccable and practically devastating. The founding dynasties had learned, through generations of dealing with each other, and then with the expanding network of commercial parties that sought access to their lanes, that the most effective exercise of institutional power is the one that proceeds entirely within the rules, because such an exercise leaves the injured party with no legitimate procedural complaint, only an injury. Earth had held a conditional certificate for 31 years when the syndicate first suspended it. That first suspension, the one that killed my daughter, was framed as a procedural matter, a compliance review, a temporary measure pending resolution of a minor filing dispute that the syndicate's secretariat had elevated, through careful bureaucratic architecture, into a formal breach. The specific nature of the filing dispute was that Earth's Commercial Transit Authority had used a designator code for a class of cargo in 12 consecutive filings that differed by a single character from the code specified in the syndicate's current classification schedule. a discrepancy that the syndicate's own port authorities had processed without objection for 3 consecutive years, and which became the subject of a formal compliance notice on the day after Earth's commercial delegation submitted a proposal that would have reduced the syndicate's transit fee authority by 12% across 15 lanes. The timing was, the syndicate's public communications office noted, entirely coincidental. The compliance review took 9 months. During those 9 months, Earth's commercial traffic in the 41 lanes dropped by 68%. 12 trade partnerships dissolved because the partners could not sustain operations under the uncertainty of whether Earth certification would be restored. 4 mid-sized shipping consortiums, unable to meet their contracts, collapsed entirely. The human firms that had built their operations around syndicate-affiliated access spent those 9 months bleeding quietly, and the syndicate watched and said nothing, because nothing was what the procedure required them to say. The review concluded with the filing dispute resolved in Earth's favor. The single-character discrepancy was deemed a formatting error not constituting substantive noncompliance, and the certificate was reinstated with a formal notation that the syndicate reserved the right to conduct further compliance reviews at its discretion. Lena was there for the compliance review. She was 31 years old in her 6th year as a trade attaché, and she had been sent to the review sessions as the junior member of a 3-person delegation. She was not the lead. She had no decision authority. She was there to observe, to take notes, and to carry the delegation's documents back to the transit hub each evening. On the 3rd day of the 6th week of the review, she was detained at the hall's secondary entrance on a charge that was never formally specified in the arrest record, the document. When Earth's legal office finally obtained a copy 2 years later, listed the reason as conduct contrary to sessional order, which is a phrase the syndicate's founding charter uses to cover a range of actions the 6 dynasties find inconvenient to name precisely. She was held for 11 days in a facility attached to the hall. On the 11th day, she died. The cause of death listed on the release notice, which arrived 3 hours after the body, was organ failure secondary to a pre-existing condition she did not have. The compliance review concluded 4 days after her death. A junior syndicate protocol officer sent a formal expression of condolence regarding the regrettable medical incident involving an unnamed member of the human delegation. No names were attached to the detention order. No inquiry was opened. The Secretariat closed the file. I tell you this not because I want your sympathy, though I will not refuse it if you offer it, but because I want you to understand the arithmetic. 11 years is a long time. It is long enough to grieve and stop grieving and arrive somewhere on the other side of grief that is not peace exactly, but is at least functional. It is long enough to spend 3 years of evenings reading 214 years of syndicate charter documents, amendment records, sessional precedents, and founding dynasty compact texts in translation. It is long enough to find, in the 3rd year of that reading, a single clause in the original Lane's compact that none of the syndicate's current officers appeared to know existed, and to understand what it meant, and to begin, very quietly, building everything you would need to use it. I want to be clear about the clause, because precision matters here. Article 31 of the Lane's Compact, the founding document signed by the 6 dynasties at the establishment of the syndicate 214 years ago, reads, in the certified translation, as follows. Where the certification authority moves to suspend or revoke the commercial access of any affiliated party across any lane or lanes enumerated in Schedule A of this compact, the suspended party shall, within the period of the suspension, hold the right to establish a parallel certification instrument for each enumerated lane so suspended, provided that the suspended party presents notification of intent to exercise this right within 30 days of the suspension's formal enactment. The article continues for several more paragraphs establishing the technical parameters of such a parallel instrument, its scope, its relationship to existing lane authorities, the conditions under which it would be recognized by the lane authorities themselves, the fee framework within which it must operate. But that opening sentence is the operative heart of it. The dynasties inserted it to use against each other. That is the only explanation that fits the historical record, and it is one I confirmed through 4 years of reading primary source dynastic correspondence that the syndicate's public archive holds in cataloged but largely unread collections. In the first 40 years of the syndicate's existence, the 6 founding bodies were not a unified bloc. They were a cartel held together by mutual profit and kept in line by mutual threat, and each of them wanted, in reserve, a mechanism that could be deployed if one of the others tried to use the certification lever to strangle a rival's commercial access. Article 31 was a deterrent. It was never used because the threat of it was enough, and as the decades passed and the dynasties consolidated into something more genuinely unified, the clause receded into the archive, unrepealed, unamended, still legally operative under the terms of the Lanes Compact's own continuity clause, which stipulates that no provision of the founding document is void through non-exercise, however prolonged. But so thoroughly forgotten that when I found it, in the 3rd year of my evening reading, the syndicate's own legal secretariat had not cited it in any document, internal or external, for 61 years. I found it on a Tuesday evening. I was reading the Founding Dynasty Compact texts because I had already read everything else, and I had nothing better to do with my evenings. I was not looking for it. I was looking for the legal basis on which the first suspension had been conducted, trying to understand what procedural architecture the syndicate had used to transform a minor filing dispute into a compliance review, because I had a vague idea of writing something, a brief, a report, a submission to whatever body might receive it, that documented the mechanism. I found Article 31 by accident, on page 47 of the Founding Compact, and I read it 3 times before I was certain I understood what it said. I did not tell anyone immediately. I sat with it for 2 weeks, reading it again each evening, checking the translation against the original compact text, which I had obtained from the syndicate's public archive through a standard document request. I wrote out the operative sentence in my own hand and put it in a drawer. I thought about what it meant, and what would be required to use it, and whether I was the right person to be thinking about using it at all. I decided after 2 weeks that I was not the right person. I was a retired envoy with a personal grievance, not a trade attorney or a policy architect. What the clause required, if it was ever going to be exercised, was not righteous anger but infrastructure, a functioning parallel certification instrument, staffed and legally constituted, capable of operating across the 41 lanes from the moment a suspension was enacted, because the 30-day window in the clause was not a generous provision. It was designed to be used immediately or not at all. Building that instrument would take years, would require institutional support I could not generate alone, and would need to be done quietly enough that the syndicate never noticed it was happening. I spent the next 8 years doing it. I want to be careful about how much I describe here, because the details involve people who did their work discreetly and deserve to continue doing it discreetly. What I can say is that I was not alone. There were others in the commercial trade service, active officers, not retired ones, people with institutional standing and access, and the ability to work the problem from the inside, who had their own reasons for caring about what the syndicate had done and what it might do again. There were legal scholars, 2 of them specialists in galactic compact law, who read Article 31 and reached the same conclusion I had, and who were willing to produce formal written opinions to that effect. There were compact law historians who confirmed, through analysis of the dynastic archive correspondence, the intent behind the article's inclusion and the circumstances of its non-use. There were commercial interests, mid-sized firms mostly, the kind that had been hurt by the first suspension and knew they would be hurt again if the syndicate moved, who were willing to invest in a contingency they might never need, because the cost of the contingency was smaller than the cost of another 9 months of bleeding through lanes they could not use. The instrument we built was called, in its internal documentation, the Lane Access Registry. It was established as a private commercial body under Earth's domestic law, which gave it a legal existence independent of any galactic certification authority. It was staffed with experienced transit coordinators, legal officers, and lane access specialists. It maintained working relationships with port authorities and transit bodies in all 41 lanes, relationships built on the ordinary commerce of ships and cargo, nothing extraordinary, nothing that would attract attention. A transit coordinator visiting a port authority to discuss standard handling procedures for a particular cargo class is a routine event. No one monitors routine events. A legal officer reviewing a lane authority's fee structure for certification compliance is unremarkable. Such reviews happen continuously throughout the lane network. We conducted hundreds of such unremarkable interactions over 8 years, and at the end of them, we had, in every lane covered by the syndicate's certification apparatus, a working relationship that would allow the registry to issue certifications that the lane authority would recognize. It held, in its archives, a fully executed set of certification instruments covering each of the 41 lanes, prepared and legally reviewed under compact law, requiring only the formal trigger of a syndicate suspension to become operative. I should say something about what those 8 years actually felt like, because from the outside, from the vantage point of someone reading this account after the fact, they may seem purposeful in a way that they were not always. There were months in the early years when the whole undertaking seemed like the thing a grieving man does to have something to do, and the distance between that and a real project was not always clear. There was a period in the 5th year when one of the legal scholars, the younger one, who had the more confident professional manner, and whose opinion I had found the harder to obtain, told me, in the middle of a routine review meeting, that he was not certain the article would survive a serious challenge from the syndicate's legal division, and that he wanted to formally revise the confidence level in his opinion from high to moderate. I spent 2 weeks reading the challenge scenarios he had outlined, checking them against the compact's continuity clause and the procedural circulars, and then I wrote back to him and walked through each scenario with the specific compact language that addressed it. And he read what I sent and reinstated the confidence level to high, but the 2 weeks were not comfortable ones. There were also years when nothing happened, which is its own particular kind of difficulty. The registry was built and staffed, and its lane relationships were maintained, and the syndicate did not move, and the commercial traffic in the 41 lanes continued in its ordinary pattern, and each year that passed without a suspension was a year in which I had no way of knowing whether the suspension would ever come or whether I had built, at considerable expense of time and other people's patience, an instrument that would never be needed. I had told myself in the 8th year that the registry had independent commercial value, and that its existence was justified even if Article 31 was never triggered. I believed that when I said it. It was also true that I thought about Lena's identification card in the bedside drawer more often in the quiet years than I did in the active ones, and that the thought had a particular quality that I will describe only as the weight of an unfinished sentence. By the 8th year it was ready. By the 9th year we were waiting. The second suspension came in the 10th year. It was not a compliance review this time. It was a formal instrument, the certification suspension of the Terran commercial designation, enacted by vote of the syndicate's sessional authority with all 6 founding dynasties in favor. The stated grounds were a pattern of conduct contrary to the syndicate's commercial norms. Specifically, Earth's commercial entities had, over the preceding 3 years, developed direct trade relationships with 7 parties in the lane network who were also clients of syndicate-affiliated firms, in a manner the syndicate characterized as systematic displacement of established commercial partners. The characterization was, in strict legal terms, imprecise. The relationships were voluntary, arm's-length commercial arrangements that the 7 parties had entered freely. But imprecision is not the same as invalidity when it appears in a formal instrument issued by a body with the procedural authority to issue it. The suspension covered all 41 affiliated lanes. Its duration was listed as indeterminate pending review. The stated grounds were the official record. What the syndicate had actually calculated was, I believe, simpler. Earth's commercial position in the lanes had grown, quietly and steadily, over the preceding decade, and the founding dynasties had decided that a second suspension would correct the trajectory before it became a structural problem. They were right that a second suspension would change the trajectory. They were wrong about the direction of the change. The suspension was read into the record on a Tuesday morning. I was in my apartment, eating dinner. I am a late diner, a habit from years of evening work. When the notification came through the official channel, I read it twice. I finished my dinner. Then I called Mara Sund. Mara was 54 years old, a career diplomat of the quiet and durable variety, the kind who have spent so long in institutional chambers that they have developed a natural immunity to the theater of such places. She had known about the lane access registry for 6 years, from the point at which it had taken sufficient shape that bringing it into the trade service's formal awareness became necessary to secure the institutional backing that would make it legally credible. She had been the one, in year 4 of its construction, who had argued successfully within the trade service that what I was building was not a personal project of a grieving father, but a legitimate contingency instrument that Earth's commercial interests required. She had carried that argument through 2 rounds of internal review and 1 very uncomfortable conversation with the trade minister. And she had done it without ever making it about Lena, because making it about Lena would have been accurate and also politically fatal, and Mara understood the distinction between accurate and useful. She said when I called her, "I'll need a copy of the Article 31 text for the folder." I told her I had one ready, a clean certified translation, cross-reference to the original compact text, with the legal opinions from the 2 compact law scholars attached as supporting documents. She said, 30 days is tight for the formal filing. I told her the registry's legal team had already drafted the filing and had it prepared for immediate submission under an accelerated protocol we had built for exactly this scenario. The filing would go in the moment we exercised the right, and we had designed it to enter the sessional record before the formal communication session began, which placed its timestamp before the 30-day window officially opened. There was a brief silence. She said, "All right." Then she said, "You should be in the room, Davin." I told her I didn't think that was appropriate. She told me that appropriate was my judgment to make and that she was asking me to make a different one. I thought about it for a long time. I said I would come as an observer, not as a delegate. She said that was fine. The syndicate had scheduled a formal session for the 14th day of the 3rd convening period, 10 days after the suspension was enacted, to present the instrument to the human delegation and receive any response. The session was, in the syndicate's institutional architecture, a formality. The delegation was to be received, the suspension was to be formally communicated in the delegation's presence, and then the session would close, and the delegation would be escorted to the transit facility to begin the process of concluding Earth's commercial presence in the lanes. The syndicate had conducted this sequence before with other parties, and it had never varied. There was no reason, from the syndicate's vantage point, to expect it would vary now. I flew to the sessional hall on a commercial carrier. I carried 1 bag. In my inner pocket I carried 1 document, a laminated identification card, standard diplomatic format, Lena's name on it, her photograph in the upper left corner, the seal of Earth's Commercial Trade Service in the lower right. It had been issued 6 months before she died, as part of the routine renewal cycle, and it had never been formally canceled because the cancellation process requires a formal request, and the Trade Services Administrative Office had let the file lapse without completing it. I had kept it in the drawer of my bedside table since the day after the release notice arrived. I took it out the morning I left for the hall and put it in my pocket. I am not certain why, except that it seemed important to have something of hers that still said she had a right to be somewhere. The sessional hall of the Vethrani Trade Syndicate is a long, rectangular room on the upper floor of the founding house, the oldest building in the syndicate's administrative complex, built from pale stone quarried from the Vethrani home system 200 years ago. The ceiling is high and vaulted, with long windows on the eastern wall that admit a flat, diffuse light in the mornings, the kind of light that is adequate without being warm. The founding dynasties sit at a curved dais at the far end, 6 elevated positions, one for each dynasty's primary representative, with staff and advisors ranked behind them in 3 tiers. The floor of the hall slopes gently upward toward the dais, so that anyone standing at the lower end, the position assigned to incoming delegations, must tilt their heads slightly to meet the eyes of the presiding officers. I have been told this was an architectural choice. I have no difficulty believing it. The human delegation sat at a long table at the lower end of the hall. There were 4 of us, Mara at the head, 2 junior officers from the Commercial Trade Service on her right, and me on her left. I was listed in the session documents as Technical Observer, a category the syndicate uses for non-speaking attendees, and which carries no formal standing and no right of address. In front of each of us was a glass of water and a notepad. In front of Mara, additionally, was a plain folder, pale gray, no markings on the cover, the kind of folder that could contain anything or nothing and therefore attracts no attention. The syndicate's presiding officer that morning was the primary representative of the Salakai dynasty, a figure whose name, in the formal session records, is rendered as First Mouth Haruval Salakai, though I will call him Haruval for the sake of brevity. He was old by the Salakai standards, which meant he was somewhere in what that species considers early elderhood, his skin the deep brownish bronze of the Salakai common phenotype, his eyes a pale gray that I have read is associated in Salakai culture with judicial rank. He wore the dynasty's formal robe, layered cloth in dark red and copper, with a wide collar that framed his face like a setting frames a stone, and small copper-colored devices at each shoulder that I eventually identified as recording instruments for the Salakai's ceremonial oral archive. He was flanked by the other 5 dynasty representatives, each in their own colors, each with the composed and slightly elevated expression of people who believe they are conducting a proceeding whose outcome is already settled. The session opened with the standard recitation, a formal declaration of the convening authority the parties present, and the matter before the hall. The recitation was delivered by a sessional clerk in the syndicate's administrative language, which I do not speak fluently, though I followed the general shape of it by watching the clerk's posture and the responses it produced in the 6 dynasty representatives. Then Haruval spoke, and the translation came through the receiver on the table, smooth, formal, the cadence of a man reading from a prepared text he has rehearsed enough that it sounds spontaneous. He said that the sessional authority of the Vethrani Trade Syndicate, convened in full founding representation, formally communicated to the Terran commercial delegation the enactment of the certification suspension of the Terran commercial designation, as adopted by unanimous vote of the founding dynasties on the 4th day of the 3rd convening period. He said that the suspension covered all 41 lanes enumerated in Schedule A of the current certification register. He said that the suspension was enacted under the authority of Article 7 of the Lanes Compact, which governs the syndicate's right to withdraw certification from any party whose conduct has been determined contrary to the standards of commercial practice upheld by the founding dynasties. He said that the suspension would remain in effect for an indeterminate period pending review, and that the terms of the review would be communicated to the Terran delegation through the syndicate's standard correspondence channel in due course. He paused. He looked at Mara. It was the practiced pause of a presiding officer who has reached the end of what he is required to say and is giving the other party the moment in which to respond. The expected response, the one the session's architecture was built to accommodate, was some form of protest, a formal objection, a request for clarification, an expression of concern. Something that confirmed the suspension had landed as intended, and that the receiving party understood itself to be diminished. Mara looked at him for a moment. She looked at the folder. She opened it, removed a single sheet of paper, one page, printed in both the syndicate's administrative language and in standard galactic common, single-spaced, with a narrow margin, and placed it on the table in front of her. She pushed it approximately 6 inches toward the center of the room. She did not stand. She did not speak. She smiled. It was not a large smile, not a triumphant one, not the smile of someone performing satisfaction for an audience. It was the smile of a person who has run a very long calculation and arrived at a result that is exactly what the calculation predicted: mild, composed, the particular expression of accurate expectation confirmed. The kind of smile that contains, if you know how to read it, an entire argument in a single line of muscle. The clerk at the base of the dais looked at the sheet. He looked at Haruval. Haruval made a small gesture, the Salakai equivalent, I had been told, of a summons, and the clerk descended from the dais, walked to our table, took the sheet, and carried it back up. Haruval read it. I watched him read it. I watched the moment, somewhere in the 3rd line of the document, when his expression changed. I want to be careful about how I describe what I saw, because I am a retired civil servant and not a poet, and the language of alien physiology is not my native register. What I can say is that the Salakai's pale gray eyes, which had been holding the composed elevation of a judge delivering a verdict he has already authored, dropped, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the particular quality of a weight shifting in a structure that was not designed to accommodate that kind of shift. His hands, which had been flat on the dais surface on either side of the document he had been reading from, moved slightly inward. Not much. An inch, perhaps less. His mouth did not open, but the muscles around it changed their configuration in a way that I can only describe as the expression of a man who has read something he was not expecting to read, and who is deciding, very quickly, what he thinks about it. He read to the end of the sheet. He set it down. He looked at the representative of the Vethrani dynasty on his left. The Vethrani was a tall figure, lean, with the characteristically elongated cranial ridge of the oldest Vethrani bloodlines, and when Haruval looked at her, she looked back at him with an expression I can only describe as the galactic universal for, I don't know what this is either. She shook her head slightly, a minimal gesture, barely perceptible, and he turned back to the sheet. Haruval said something to the clerk in a low voice, in the syndicate's administrative language. The clerk went to one of the advisory staff behind the dais. A consultation began, quiet, concentrated, conducted in the administrative language with the economical urgency of people running down a problem they need to resolve quickly. I watched it from the lower end of the hall without expression. Beside me, Mara had reclosed the folder and set her hands on the table. A 3rd member of the advisory staff was summoned to the consultation. Then a 4th. The voices did not rise, but the rhythm changed, shorter exchanges, tighter questions, the specific cadence of people triangulating toward a conclusion they are not finding where they expected it to be. The Movan representative, a compact, broad-shouldered figure whose dynasty is known throughout the lanes for its aggressive commercial instincts and its particular impatience with procedural uncertainty, leaned forward and said something to the Drell representative beside him in a tone that the translation system, which I had set to monitoring, only rather than active translation, rendered as, "What is this?" The Drell representative, older and considerably more composed, placed a hand briefly on the Movan's forearm, and said something in return that the system rendered as wait. Haruval asked the translation system, addressing it in standard galactic common, the first time in the session he had used that language, to confirm whether the document before him constituted a formal notice of intent to exercise rights under Article 31 of the Lanes Compact. The translation system confirmed it. Haruval asked whether Article 31 remained in force under the current certified text of the Lanes Compact. There was a pause of several seconds. The translation system, which is a procedural tool and does not make legal interpretations, said that it was not competent to provide legal analysis, but could confirm that Article 31 appeared in the current certified text of the Lanes Compact without notation of repeal or amendment, as verified against the version held in the Sessional Record Office. The Orith representative, the oldest member of the dais, a figure of considerable personal gravitas in her dynasty's ceremonial dress, who had been sitting in perfect stillness since the session opened, spoke for the first time. Her voice carried without effort across the length of the hall. She asked the clerk to produce the original Lanes Compact text, not a translation, not a digital record. The original bound volume, held in the founding house's primary archive, which the sessional protocol requires to be present in the building during any session that involves the Compact's fundamental provisions, in case of exactly this kind of dispute. The clerk went to a cabinet behind the dais and returned with the volume, thick, covered in the dark leather-equivalent material of the Orith tanning tradition, the edges of its pages worn to soft uniformity by 2 centuries of occasional consultation. The Orith took it. She turned to the relevant section with the practiced motion of someone who has handled old documents many times and knows how much pressure to apply. She read for perhaps 3 minutes. The hall was silent while she read. She set the volume down with the specific careful motion of someone placing a heavy thing where they want it to stay. The session had now been running for 51 minutes. The 6 dynasty representatives were in a consultation that had expanded beyond the advisory staff and now included, from what I could observe, at least 2 senior legal officers who had been summoned from elsewhere in the founding house. There was a quality to the consultation that I recognized from my own years in chambers. It was the quality of people who have found themselves in an unanticipated procedural situation and are working, under time pressure, to determine whether the situation is as bad as it appears. The answer in this case was that it was. Haruval looked at Mara. The pale gray eyes had changed. The elevated composure of a judge conducting an expected proceeding was gone, and in its place was something I had not expected to see on the face of a man of his institutional rank, which was careful, undisguised attention. The attention of someone who has reassessed a situation rapidly and is in the process of deciding what the new situation requires. He asked, in standard galactic common, whether the document submitted by the Terran delegation represented a formal notice of intent to establish a parallel certification instrument under Article 31. Mara said yes. He asked whether the instrument was prepared for operation. Mara said yes. He asked how long it had been in preparation. Mara said that it had been in preparation for 8 years. There was a silence after that, not the procedural silence between one exchange and the next, not the silence of a room processing information in the ordinary way that rooms process things. The particular silence I described at the beginning of this account, the held breath, the stillness before a very large thing falls. The 6 founding dynasty representatives of the Vethrani Trade Syndicate sat in their elevated positions at the curved dais, and the thing they had done that morning sat in the room with them, and none of them, I think, had any clear idea of what came next. I looked at the dais for a long moment. Then I looked down at the table in front of me. I took Lena's identification card from my inner pocket and placed it on the table. I did not place it with any ceremony. I did not hold it up or draw attention to it. I placed it face up on the table, photograph facing the ceiling, trade service seal visible in the lower right corner, and then I put my hands flat on either side of it and looked at the dais again. Mara, beside me, did not look at it. She did not need to. She had known it was in my pocket since I told her, on the transit to the hall that morning, that I was going to bring it. What Article 31 said, in the operative terms that mattered in that room. The certification suspension that the founding dynasties had enacted that morning, with all 6 voting in favor, with the full formal authority of the certification body behind it, with the presiding officer reading its text into the record in the precise language the Lanes Compact prescribed. That suspension was, simultaneously, the legal trigger for Earth to establish a parallel certification instrument for all 41 lanes covered by the action. The Lane Access Registry, 8 years in preparation, was that instrument. Its existence had been filed with the syndicate's own sessional record office at the moment the morning session convened. A filing that entered the record before the suspension was formally communicated to the delegation, placing its timestamp before the 30-day window technically opened. The 30-day window mattered because Article 31 requires the suspended party to present notification of intent within 30 days of enactment. The filing timestamp predated the formal communication of the suspension by 37 minutes. Mara's legal team had spent a considerable amount of time over 2 years examining whether this sequence, filing before communication, rather than after, created any procedural vulnerability in the exercise of the right. The analysis turned on the compact's language, 30 days of the suspension's formal enactment, not 30 days of notification. Enactment and notification are different events in the syndicate's own procedural framework. Enactment occurs when the vote is recorded and the instrument enters the sessional record. Notification occurs when the instrument is formally communicated to the affected party. The syndicate's own procedural documents confirm this distinction in at least 3 separate administrative circulars over the past 40 years. The filing predated both. 2 external compact law scholars had confirmed that this sequence did not invalidate the exercise. If anything, it made the exercise more textually precise than a filing submitted after notification would have been. The syndicate's advisory staff were running the same analysis now. I could see it in the rhythm of the consultation. The way they were working through the compact's language, checking the procedural circulars, looking for the link in the chain that does not hold. They were not going to find it. We had spent 2 years looking for it ourselves. We had wanted to find it, because the exercise of Article 31 was only worth doing if it held under scrutiny, and the best way to verify that it held was to attack it with the same rigor the syndicate's own legal staff would bring. We found no flaw. The syndicate would find none either, though I understood that they would need more time than we had needed, because they were doing the work under time pressure and in a state of institutional surprise, which is never conducive to careful legal reasoning. The session recessed at the 58th minute. Harrowville announced a recess of 2 hours. The founding dynasties withdrew through the door behind the dais. We remained in the hall. One of the junior officers from the trade service, Ter, the elder of the 2, a decade into his career, and experienced enough to understand in broad terms what had happened without knowing all of its interior history, opened his briefing tablet and began reviewing documents with the focused calm of a man who has enough to occupy him and no need to manufacture occupation. The other, Sorrel, 3 years in, who had approached this assignment with the slightly heightened attention of someone piecing together a picture whose full dimensions she does not yet see, sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the middle distance. Mara sat with her hands folded on the table and her eyes somewhere above the dais. I drank my glass of water. I thought about Lena. I thought about a conversation we had 3 weeks before she left for the compliance review. She was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, going over her assignment briefing, and she said, not with bitterness, not with complaint, with the matter-of-fact tone she had always used for institutional realities, that the compliance review was designed to go badly, that the filing dispute was thin cover for something else, some signal the syndicate wanted to send about the limit of what Earth's commercial presence in the lanes could become. She said she didn't know what specific result the syndicate was engineering, but she could feel the architecture of it, the way the compliance notice had been structured, the way the timeline had been compressed, the way the delegations had been told that the review was procedurally simple and should resolve quickly, which in her experience was something institutional bodies said when they wanted you to arrive without adequate preparation. I told her to be careful. She said she would be. She smiled at me across the kitchen table with the same quality of smile I had just watched Mara produce at the lower end of the sessional hall. A calm, slightly interested acknowledgement of a situation she had already assessed and found, if not comfortable, at least legible, and she said, "They think we don't understand how the machine works. That's their problem, not ours." I have thought about that sentence many times in 11 years. I thought about it now, sitting in the sessional hall with her identification card on the table in front of me, and the founding dynasties of the Vethrani Trade Syndicate in a consultation room reassessing everything they had done that morning. She was 31 years old when she said it. She had been reading the syndicate's procedural documents as part of her attaché training for 2 years before the compliance review, and what she had found in that reading was the same general awareness that I found years later through a much more systematic search, that the syndicate's founding architecture contained within it the mechanisms of its own limitation, and that those mechanisms had never been tested because no party had been sufficiently motivated to test them. She had told me about it in passing, the kind of remark that sounds like ordinary work conversation and which only acquires its full weight in retrospect. I did not, in that kitchen table conversation, understand that she was telling me something important. I understood it later. The recess lasted 2 hours and 23 minutes. When the founding dynasties returned to the hall, the quality of their entrance was different from their earlier composure. Not agitated, the 6 representatives were experienced institutional figures, and experienced institutional figures do not enter rooms agitated, because agitation is information, and information in a chamber is power seated. But there was a quality in the way they settled into their positions that I recognized from long experience, the quality of people who have finished an argument and arrived at a conclusion they did not set out to reach. Harival sat. He arranged the documents before him. He looked at Mara. Then he said formally for the sessional record that the syndicate's legal advisory office had reviewed the documents submitted by the Terran delegation and had confirmed, subject to further formal analysis, that Article 31 of the Lanes Compact remained in legal force and that the conditions for its exercise appeared on initial review to have been met. He said that the syndicate wished to note, for the record, its position that the article's application in the present circumstances raised significant questions of procedural interpretation, that the body reserved the right to examine in detail through the appropriate review mechanisms. He said that, pending that examination, the syndicate was prepared to acknowledge the receipt of the notification of intent. Then, formally, he said that the syndicate wished to inquire, for the purposes of the session record, what the Terran commercial delegation's intentions were with respect to the scope and operation of the parallel certification instrument. Mara said that the lane access registry would operate across all 41 lanes covered by the suspension, at standard certification fees, open to any commercial party regardless of existing syndicate affiliation or relationship status. The Drell representative, the eldest at the dais, who had been most composed throughout, asked whether the registry was intended to be a permanent institution or a temporary measure. Mara said that it was designed to operate for the duration of the suspension, and for any period thereafter that Earth's commercial interests required a certification alternative in the lanes. The Movan representative asked, with the directness that Dynasty is known for, whether Earth intended to use the registry to displace the syndicate's commercial role in the lanes rather than simply to protect Earth's own access. Mara said that the registry's purpose was to provide certification services for parties who required them. She said that the commercial decisions of individual lane network parties about which certification body to use and on what terms were, as they had always been, those parties' own to make. She did not say that several major lane network commercial parties had already entered into preferred rate discussions with the registry's business development office in the weeks preceding the session. She did not say that 3 of the syndicate's own affiliated firms had, through intermediaries, made preliminary inquiries about the registry's parallel certification process. Those things would become apparent in the ordinary course of commerce, and things that become apparent in the ordinary course of commerce carry a different weight than things that are announced. Haruval sat for a moment. He looked once at the identification card on the table in front of me. His pale gray eyes held it for perhaps 2 seconds, long enough to register what it was, or perhaps long enough to guess. Then he looked back at Mara. He said, for the sessional record, that the syndicate would undertake a comprehensive review of the current suspension determination in light of the Article 31 notification, and would communicate to the Terran delegation through the standard correspondence channel its findings in due course. Mara said that the delegation looked forward to receiving the communication. The session was formally closed. The junior officers gathered their materials. Mara placed the folder in her bag. I picked up Lena's identification card and put it back in my inner pocket. The 4 of us walked to the hall's main doors together, in the flat diffused light from the eastern windows, which had shifted to afternoon by now, still adequate, still without opinion, precisely the same quality of light that had been in the room when the session began. There was a courtyard between the founding house and the administrative complex, wide, paved with the same pale stone, 3 ornamental trees at regular intervals along the path to the transit gate. The day was clear, the light direct. We walked at an ordinary pace. When we reached the first tree, Mara said, the formal withdrawal of the suspension will take them between 4 and 6 weeks. They'll need to make it look procedurally considered, like they reached the conclusion through their own process. I said I understood. She said, the registry will be fully operational before they send the withdrawal notice. I said I knew. At the second tree, Sorrel said, quietly, how long did you know about Article 31? I said 11 years. She absorbed that for several steps. Then she said, and the registry. I said 8 years of building, 3 years of knowing it existed. She was quiet until we reached the transit gate. Then she said, did you know they would trigger it, the second suspension? I said I had not always known. I said that in the 3rd year after I found the article, I thought it was possible. In the 5th year, after the registry had taken shape and we had begun building the lane relationships, I thought it was probable. In the 8th year, when the registry was ready and I allowed myself to look at the syndicate's internal commercial dynamics with the question of likelihood in mind, I thought it was near certain. I said that a body that has used an instrument once tends to reach for it again when it wants the same result, and that the syndicate had used the certification lever against Earth once before and found it effective, and that there was no particular reason for them to believe it would fail a second time. Sorrel said, and if they hadn't, if they'd never moved again. I said that the registry would still exist, that it would continue to operate as a contingency, that a certification alternative in the 41 lanes has commercial value independent of whether it is ever triggered by a suspension. I said that eventually the syndicate would do what powerful institutional bodies tend to do, which is reach again for the instrument that worked, and when they did, the registry would be ready. The gate clerk processed our transit documentation with mild professional efficiency. We thanked him. We sat in the transit waiting area, pale stone, flat institutional light, departure board, rows of seating, and we waited for the carrier. I looked at the departure board without reading it. I thought about Lena, not about the kitchen table conversation, not about the identification card, not about any of the legal architecture of what had just happened. I thought about the way she ate quickly, as though there were something more interesting waiting on the other side of the meal. I thought about the sound of her laugh, which was low and slightly delayed, arriving a beat after the thing that produced it, as if she wanted to be certain she was laughing at the right part. I thought about her handwriting, which was small and precise, and which I used to tease her about because she had clearly been trained in whatever system produces the smallest possible letters. I thought about these things until they were the only things in the room, and then I thought about them some more. I thought about the day, 2 years after she died, when I went to her apartment to clear it out, a task I had been avoiding because there was no urgency, and because urgency would have required me to be honest about why I was avoiding it. Her books were arranged on the shelf in the order she had read them, which was not alphabetical or by subject, and which followed some personal logic I had never asked her to explain. Her coffee cup was still in the drain board. There was a notepad on her desk with a list in her small, precise handwriting, not a to-do list, not a work document, just observations she had written to herself about a trade policy paper she had been reading, notes in the margins of her own thinking, the kind of intellectual housekeeping people do when they want to understand something thoroughly. I read the notepad 3 times before I put it in my bag. I still have it. On the 3rd page, near the bottom, in the same small handwriting she had written, "The mechanism is in the founding documents. No one has bothered to look." She was right. That was what she had always been telling me. I simply needed 11 years and a Tuesday evening in the 3rd year to hear it properly. The carrier arrived. We boarded. The commercial port was 3 hours out, and through the window on the port side, the founding house's pale stone caught the afternoon light, the vault of the sessional hall just visible above the roofline, the courtyard with its 3 ornamental trees still and ordinary in the clear day. I watched it until it was gone. Mara, seated across from me, said, in the particular tone she reserves for observations that are accurate but not urgent, "You should consider whether you want to be present for the formal suspension withdrawal session. They'll want a delegation there to receive the instrument. It's a document worth having someone witness." I said I thought the trade service could handle the withdrawal without me. She said probably. She looked at me for a moment with the expression of a person who is about to say something they have chosen their words for carefully. She said, she would have found the article herself, eventually. You know that. I said I did know that. She said 3 years, maybe 4. She was faster with texts than you are. I said that was probably true. She looked out the window. After a moment she said, "The registry is going to be running for a long time, possibly indefinitely. The commercial dynamics in the lanes aren't going to change enough to make an independent certification alternative unnecessary." She paused. "Someone will need to sit on the oversight board, someone who understands the full history, the founding documents, the lane relationships, how the Article 31 mechanism actually works in practice." She looked back at me. "Someone who knows where everything is." I said I would think about it. She nodded. She turned back to her tablet. I looked out the window at the space the administrative complex had occupied until there was nothing left to see. I thought about what Lena had said, not the specific words which I have already quoted and which are exact. I have had 11 years to commit them to memory, and I have not misremembered them once. I thought about what she meant, not the article, not the registry, not the legal mechanism or the 8 years of preparation or the 4 hours in the sessional hall. The thing she meant was simpler than all of that, and truer, and it is what I want to say at the end of this account, which I have been writing for several weeks now, and which I will eventually give to the Trade Service Archive, and which I hope someone reads someday when they are trying to understand how the second certification crisis ended. What she meant was this: the machine that powerful institutions build to manage, contain, or eliminate those they consider lesser. That machine is built from rules. Rules that the powerful write for their own purposes, in their own language with their own intentions, and then set aside when the purposes have been served and the intentions fulfilled. Rules that remain, after the setting aside, exactly what they were when they were written, operative, binding, unchanged by the fact of being forgotten. The institution builds the machine. The machine accumulates its history, and if you are willing to read the history, all of it, the parts they reference and the parts they don't, the founding documents and the amendment records and the 61-year-old citations in a clause that no one has needed for 61 years, then the machine will work for you as well as it works for them. Better, perhaps, because you know it is there and they have forgotten. They think we don't understand how the machine works. That is their problem, not ours. The Vethrani Trade Syndicate withdrew the certification suspension of the Terran commercial designation 38 days after the session in the founding house. The withdrawal instrument cited a comprehensive review that had determined the grounds for the original suspension to be, on further analysis, insufficiently substantiated under Article 7 of the Lanes Compact. It made no reference to Article 31 or to the Lane Access Registry. The Lane Access Registry was fully operational across all 41 lanes before the withdrawal notice was filed with the Sessional Record Office. As of the date of this writing, it has processed 14,412 commercial certifications. 3 syndicate-affiliated trading firms have applied for parallel registry certification as a secondary instrument, citing operational flexibility in their applications. The syndicate has not communicated any formal position on those applications. The registry's legal team expects it will not. Lena's identification card is in the drawer of my desk at home. I have not carried it since the afternoon in the sessional hall. I do not need to carry it anymore. It has been where it belonged. She was right. That is all I wanted to say.